Welcome. We are so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Joe Sommer. I'm the Executive Director of the CEEP Network, and we are really pleased to be bringing this panel on care and crisis together. We are pleased to be joined by Aaron and Dustin, and I know that they have some wonderful, hopeful words for us in the next few minutes. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to begin our introductions and to facilitate the conversation. Thank you, Aaron and Dustin, for being with us.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe, and thank you to the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes for providing space for this important conversation to take place. My name is Erin Weber Johnson. I am an Episcopalian attending St. John the Evangelist in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I have long enjoyed spending time with CEEP. I'm senior consultant at Vandersall Collective, and it is my joy to be joined today by co-editor of volume Crisis and Care, Meditations on Faith and Philanthropy, co-editor Dr. Dustin Bennek. A little bit about Dustin for you all. He, like myself, wears a lot of different hats. So Dustin is visiting assistant professor of practical theology at Baylor University. He's also the visiting research fellow for the Center of Studies of Religion and Society. Did I get that right? Good. In addition to being an excellent thought partner and source of hope for this work. And so today, as we talk about care and crisis, I'm so excited to have this space with all of you. Dustin.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and I'll just echo Aaron's gratitude to Joe and CEEP. It really is such a privilege to be here with all of you. One of our hopes in this volume was that it would create space for new conversations around faith and philanthropy, specifically where crisis and care are converging. This project emerged out of the belly of the pandemic as we began to discern what is possible where crisis and care converge. And as we listened to communities of faith, we began to realize that matters of faith and funding became the limit of the horizon for so many people of faith. People could not see past what they could not imagine that they could fund. When you're no longer passing the plate in Sunday worship service, all of a sudden we come to recognize our collective precarity as well as our collective vulnerability. So Aaron and I, early in the pandemic, began to think about what might it look like to gather friends and colleagues around these emerging questions of philanthropy. We gathered 15 thoughtful voices, practitioners, thought leaders from across what we'll call the Ecclesial Ecology. This included our friends Amy Butler, Dave Harder, Aimee Laramore, Kevin Kim Wright, Eric Barreto, Emily Hull McGee, David King, Mieke Vandersall, Patrick Reyes, Shannon Hopkins, Mark Sampson, Trey Wince, Sunia Gibbs, and Thad Austin. I know many of these voices and faces are familiar to some of you, and you will know that they are thoughtful, measured, patient, and above all, hopeful. So we invited these friends to respond to questions that were organized around philanthropy. And as we did so, we began to work towards a definition of philanthropy that was more than just dollars and cents and technique, but was actually a way of life. Specifically, it was a way of life marked by generosity, including the ability to give and be received by others in order to enrich the common good. We recognized that new forms of philanthropy were emerging from spaces and places of belonging as we were invited to live a life in relation to others and for others. And over the course of this volume, we encountered surprise and surprise again as we took a risk of trying to offer something out into the world and inviting other people into it. We found that we were received by them. We were received by our authors. We were received gracefully by early conversation partners. We were received by our readers. And out of this space of new connection and belonging, we began to imagine what it will look like to rekindle philanthropic imagination. So friends, we offer this volume, Crisis and Care, back to you as a gift to the communities we love so deeply and care about. And as a gift, we wanted to offer it in a way that could be accessible. We know that many of you who are gathered today are strapped for time, strapped for energy. You and your people might be tired. So we intentionally organized this volume around what we called meditations. We think about them as a word on point. They're intentionally brief, approximately 2,000 words. They're contextually rooted, and they're drawing from the wisdom of the particularities and traditions that each of these authors occupy. So we offered this set of meditations as a resource back to you in the space of precarity, in the space of restlessness, in this place of fatigue, in the event that it can be a guide for you moving forward. And then as we listen to these various voices and begin to craft the volume, we sensed that something was happening in this space that we could have never imagined on our own. We realized that people were giving new language, new metaphors, new stories that could guide us and give us hope as we crossed over from the shadows of this moment. Certainly the shadows of the social ecclesial crises of 2020 and 2021, but also the shadows of the various other crises, seen and unseen, that mark the many other parts of our life. So friends, we're glad you're here today. We feel very honored to get to share this space with you. And we want to have a conversation around this work, because so much of this work has emerged in conversation. Conversation between Aaron and I, and conversation with these authors. So we hope that you'll lean into conversation. Please feel free to drop some questions in the chat, and we will try to be as responsive and engaging as possible, because we're grateful that you're here and we're excited to see what we can imagine together.
In preparing for today, we wanted to frame the conversation in this framework of crossing over. I'd like to read a short excerpt from our conclusion. And then from there, we'll walk through a series of questions, both inviting a response and dialogue of one another, but also at any point wanting to have a conversation with you all. And so please feel free to utilize the chat we offer today as a gift to you. So this from the conclusion of Crisis and Care. In Joshua 4:5-7, we read, Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord, your God, in the midst of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean? And then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. In our haste to find resolution and the comfort of stability, it might be easy to brush past this crossing over moment in the narrative. We like to know the end, and so our imaginations are reluctant to linger in this moment of liminality, instead rushing to the outcome. But the narrative here seems to linger, pausing to note the manner in which they are to cross over. Joshua invites a newly constituted people to cross the river into a new land, and on the way charges each of the leaders of the 12 tribes to pick up a stone from the river. They are to carry these rocks with them as weighty markers, as a memorial. And in fact, these are to be a sign provoking future generations to ask, what do these stones mean? In creating this volume, we sought to mark the past 4 years as a time of crossing over. And yet in the midst of this transition, we still don't know what the days ahead will hold. What do these stones mean? How do we mark this time of crossing over? So Dustin, in the early stages of this pandemic, this work was catalyzed. What was the source of that catalyzation?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. You know, as I think about some of the early stages of this collaborative work, I'm reminded that it emerged out of an abundance of care. You know, I think one point of intersection between our various works and forms of service and communities of faith is a posture of care, an attempt to care for the various places we serve or study. And out of that care, it also emerged from this contextual engagement. You know, as we were listening to what was happening in these various communities of faith, as we began to wonder what the future will hold for ourselves, for our communities, for our institutions, for our families. And out of that, and out of these existing connections and collaborations, new questions began to emerge. As I was listening to you read the conclusion again today, I'm reminded of the power of questions, where you concluded with these two elegant questions. What do these stones mean? And how do we mark this time of crossing over? And I'm reminded how the early stages of this volume were an attempt to just craft and recraft questions that could give us a more hopeful imagination, and then send those questions out to people that were thoughtful scholars and thoughtful practitioners to help us see and imagine faithful ways forward. But what about from you? I mean, from your perspective, you know, what were some of the key catalysts to this collective convening work?
Yeah, you know, we took a bit of a risk with this one, didn't we?
Right, yeah. And it's here.
It is. And I'm reminded, you know, in our book, we actually, one of the authors, Sunia Gibbs, talks a lot about the importance of experimenting in this moment. And I think as we were thinking about the questions, we also had this sense of needing to test this out. Would this work? Would it work to gather the voices? What would come from a conversation, especially in a moment where there was such significant divisiveness and frankly, territorialism around a false narrative of self-sufficiency, right? You know, we have to protect our own, take care of our own. And so we felt like this was a bit of a counterintuitive move, but to reach beyond ourselves into conversation with folks from diverse sectors, the artists, the dreamers, the practitioners, the teachers, the pastors, inviting folks into this work as a big experiment, hoping that what we would receive would be something that would serve the people that we loved. And it was so much more than what we could have dreamed and hoped for. I can remember each time we got a chapter back, sometimes being moved to tears by the raw reflections, by the bravery and the courage and the trust that had been given to us. I was, in the process, a more hopeful person. And that is what has, frankly, pushed me to want to give the opportunity for others to be part of this conversation, is the desire to spread hope and imagination.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, your comments just bring to mind so many different examples of authors that rekindled hope and gave me new language, new metaphors, new imagination. Whether it's Sunia's chapter on Everything is an Experiment, where she talks about her work as a pastor, activist, artist, or Dave Harder's chapter on moving our imagination from buildings from liability to asset, or Shannon Hopkins and Mark Sampson, who describe this forest imagination. Oh my goodness, these words, these phrases, these stories gave me an anchor in the midst of uncertainty, transition, and precarity. They grounded my imagination in a way that kindled hope. And then as I listened to other stories like Hull McGee, who described the faithfulness of letting go, or Aimee Laramore, who invites us to imagine what we need to leave behind, I began to wonder, what are the things I need to let go of out of this moment? And as I serve communities of faith and teach and form students, how can I invite them to live into a similar way of life? Such a gift.
One of the participants, Dustin, invited a question that I think is a powerful one, and asked, "Has this provide us with an opportunity to go deeper in our faith, or the authors themselves?" One of the things that came up for us over and over as we read this was the particular practice of holding space for grief, the rituals and traditions around this grief, making sure that we marked it, and at the same time also providing space for Sabbath, for deep rest. We all know how hard you all are working. And these two practices were part of the spirituality that guided these meditations as well, emerged from the meditations themselves. And I think it's an interesting thing, because while the voices themselves are very diverse, there were these themes that continued to emerge. And I think it speaks to the rich ecclesial ecology of the work. Dustin, would you mind talking us through what ecclesial ecology is?
Yeah, happily, Aaron. And I think that's one of our hopes for this volume, is that it would surface the texture and the vibrancy of the ecology. Because rather than inviting people from a single sector, such as congregations or theological schools or faith-based nonprofits, we invited people to contribute from across the ecclesial landscape. And we did so by introducing this concept of an ecclesial ecology, which we defined in the introduction as the constellation of identifiable forms of organized ecclesial life, such as congregations and parishes, theological schools, Christian colleges and universities, philanthropic centers, and nonprofits, as well as experiments in creative deviance and the boundary space between existing and emerging orders. And I think the vibrancy and the vitality of the ecology requires the whole. You need these anchor institutions. You need parishes. You need big steeple churches. You need theological educational institutions. You need nonprofits. You need philanthropists. And you need people who are innovating on the edge of them. And we wanted to invite people from this ecology to reflect together. As we did so, we began to think about two different ways the ecology functions. I wrote a brief chapter towards the end that talks about the ecology as first a place. It's actually these grounded social expressions, particular places, particular story. Each community has its own contextual dimensions, its own way of life. There are particular places, but they're also interconnected. And as we listened to people, we also saw how participation in the ecology functions like a prism, much like a prism that you shine light through and it expands into an array of color. We witnessed how people's participation in these various places and the connections across them reform and reshape the imagination. So our hope was that we could bring to the surface this ecology, offer resources back into it, and then release people, language, and imaginations to live into a more connected ecclesial life. But Aaron, I'm so curious to hear from you as well, because I know you have served and studied and worked across this ecology. So can you tell us how this language has stirred some new imagination for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of you may have heard me in previous workshops, even through CEEP, talk about money narratives and how our relationship to money, our relationship to God is deeply formed by some of our most earliest experiences, and how these relationships with money then can form how we lead, how we give, our philanthropic expressions. So when thinking about imagination, Mieke Vandersall has this terrific chapter where she talks about how innovation, ecclesial innovation, takes place at the rupture site between our money narratives, so the stories that we hold about money ourselves, and the alternative economies that are outlined in the scriptures. That was a giant aha moment for me around philanthropic imagination, because so often the work that I feel that I do, that we do as leaders in church, is trying to say, where is that connective tissue? Where is that place of convergence between my story and the story of God? And that's where imagination springs forth. Innovation emerges at the point of contact between, however, the different members of that ecology, so that the ongoing work of God in and through communities of faith are manifested in this imaginative work. And it's also reflective to me that in the same way that the interrelated crises of the moment are not sector specific, so care was emerging across sectors to meet crises in imaginative ways. So, for example, we saw the extensive generosity so many of the clergy showed when shifting their worship online, or shifting to a hybrid approach, or shifting the way that pastoral care was provided, or how people began to wrestle with this wonderful question that Darren Walker raised in the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes plenary at the last conference of what do we give back, or what do we give up instead of giving back? These questions of imagination are stirred at that point of convergence. And so it's impossible for us in this moment to know what is ahead of us. And it was impossible, frankly, when we wrote the book and co-edited the different chapters, for us to imagine what was coming next. To locate this in a time and place. This took place as we were editing the chapters before we knew the election results of the last presidential election. We wrote the chapters before we knew whether there would be a vaccine available to us this year. We wrote these chapters before we knew the outcome of the trial of the murder of George Floyd. So many things we did not know. And so instead of providing a book that perhaps lent itself towards prescription, we wanted to provide space that lent itself towards promise, that kindled imagination. We learned that philanthropic imagination, it exists in the space between the stories we told ourselves about who we are and where faith is calling us to be. And so one of the biggest things that we learned, one of the emerging themes from the book, was that holding space for this tension of the unknown is an act of generosity too, in the same way that pastors extended themselves to adapt, so is holding this space for the tension. And so what does holding space look like? Well, for some of our authors, it meant marking our grief. It meant sharing our stories. It meant asking, as Aimee Laramore brilliantly puts, what do we carry with us now? What do we let go of? How do we explore these questions together?
You know, Erin, I love the way you end by talking about together, because the question of this volume is trying to think towards a new form of togetherness. And, you know, one of the things we witnessed in this volume is how matters of finances and budgets are key markers, key indicators of how so many people of faith and congregations organize their common life, how they work towards their togetherness. So for those people who are gathered here that have responsibilities for finances and budgets of their churches, for leaders who are trying to reimagine the relationship between faith and philanthropy in the wake of this rupture, what do you think is a good first step towards new imagination?
And we begin with, I believe, questions. So often in my own work around money narratives, I will begin by asking, what was your first experience of money? What was your first experience of money in the church or of giving, right? I can remember, it was a few years ago, I was leading some money narrative retreats for an Upper East Side church in New York. And we had a cohort of millennials. And I asked the group this exact question: what is your first experience with money? And each identified the stock market shift in 2008 and 2009 as having a defining feature for their narrative. Specifically, what it meant for them to feel as if they had less options, or feel like they could not live into markers of adulthood the way that they had been formed to live into. These experiences deeply formed them as givers, but as Christians, right? As they saw their own faith reflected in their story. And what I am mindful of in this moment, and last time I talked about it, I almost started crying, so I'm going to try not to today. But what I am mindful of today, and always when we're talking about this work, is the way that our own children are going to be carrying the weight of the past 2 years. We talk about, we know in science that our bodies carry trauma, and that this trauma will be seen in generations to come. And so as I think about how we frame this moment as we mark it, I think the most important work we can be doing is asking these questions, not just of our leaders, but of our entire communities. One of the most beautiful reflections in our well, I love them all, but one of our beautiful authors, Eric Barreto, talks a lot about belonging as seen through the lens of acts. And he, in his work, talks about how we embody witness. He uses the word in flesh witness in the frame of belonging. It's a faithful, fragile belonging. As I think about the horrors we witnessed of the murder of George Floyd and countless other Black and Brown people of God, I am mindful of our need to ask these questions, to mark the moment, and to remember that we are not self-sufficient, but we belong to one another. And that is where imagination can begin. Dustin, I'm also mindful that this belonging, it describes not just human need, but it also describes organizational adaptation. I know that you do a lot of work around local context. As you think about local context, how did that play into this framework of paying attention to what is happening?
That's right. Thanks, Erin. You know, I'm just struck by, you know, how you started by talking about the power of questions.
Yeah.
And for so many organizations that I work with and study and listen to, the renewal of individual and collective imagination oftentimes emerges as they ask a different type of question together. There's this kind of spacious we. Where oftentimes you'll hear leaders say we, and you want to know who the we is. And when you talk to them further, it's me and this person and that person and that person. And I just think about story time and time again when I've talked to people across the country. You know, one of the things that I've seen is that as they ask a different type of question, it renews their imagination. And the second thing is, as I think about the priority of context, you know, whether it's from the East Coast in Vermont, or small church on Rhode Island, or a big steeple church in San Francisco, or sitting across from a pastor in Pike's Place, or the peanut fields in Georgia. I mean, from across these spaces, I've heard time and time again that when I ask people, what are the challenges you're facing and how are you adapting to them? On the one hand, there is some anxiety about financial precarity, but when people adapt organizationally, it oftentimes emerges as they recognize and listen to what's already going on. They see the abundance in what is already there. They see the word and work of God springing up. Our friend and colleague Nate Stuckey talks about this as seeing the cracks in our institutional spaces, and not only recognizing those as spaces of fragility, but also recognizing those as spaces of possibility.
Yeah.
So when people listen to what's already going on and the Spirit of God fills their imaginations, they see new possibilities. But I'm also mindful of a word from our colleague and contributor, Kevin Kim Wright, who notes the importance of rest. I think in this moment of heightened anxiety, precarity, a restless discontent with the status quo, where we want to take advantage of the opportunity to change things that have needed to change for a long time. In their space, there can be an anxiety that drives us into away from rest, and we're restless. So I think Kevin's word to us in this volume and elsewhere is to create space for rest. And in many cases, as I've studied and served organizations, I've seen that they build in spaces of rest, spaces of care, and to return to your language that we heard from Eric Barreto, spaces of belonging. And it's actually out of belonging that we can reimagine our common life.
I love how you frame context in this and the cracks. I'm reminded of, so Amy Butler wrote a beautiful chapter that I think combines both of the beautiful concepts, where she describes her vision for invested faith, which is a social initiative where churches that want to faithfully use their resources, but are seeing themselves at a point of closure, invest their resources in this pooled fund, and then the fund grants new ministry initiatives. I believe just last week, Invested Faith put out 5 new grants for new ministries. And playing on these chapters of the generosity of death, paying attention to what is the opportunity before us as well. Where do we see resurrection? And so when I think about how we've all needed to adapt during the pandemic, and how I know we're all facing the fall and wondering what more will be asked of us, what kind of wisdom guides adaptation? I think that's the question that guided a lot of this volume. What kind of wisdom guides adaptation? What sustains it? What needs to be left behind?
Right. Because that's really what we were after in this volume, Erin, was wisdom. Wisdom that emerged from an abundance of care. And I think we sensed early on that in order for us to discern and surface and release this wisdom, we needed to find ways to do it together. How collaboration was actually part and parcel of the wisdom that could guide us forward in this moment. So I remember how we talked about the work our work together as collaborating in a performative mode,
Yeah.
where we're trying to point to the possibility of collaborating to transform a common life. We also thought about our work partnering with our authors as coming alongside them in collaborative, creative partnership. I think about Thad Austin's contribution to this work, where he says, in a post-pandemic world, collaboration is required. No doubt this has always been the case for people of faith, but in the aftermath of this moment, as we emerge from the shadows, collaboration is required. I also think about how the wisdom is contextual, but it's contextual in a way that is grounded in the ordinary realities that mark the life of faith. I think about Patrick Reyes's beautiful, beautiful chapter about the wisdom that emerges from his grandma's table. It's a space of beloved belonging and courage and protection and hospitality.
Yeah.
It's a space where each individual has a place, and yet those who have historically set the table are no longer those who have a privilege at the table alone.
Right.
They are positioned in relation to others. So it's a contextual wisdom. I'm also reminded how I think it's a conjunctive wisdom. You know, the very nature and title of this volume is conjunctive. It's crisis and care. And for so many of our authors and contributors, they were leaning into this conjunctive wisdom. They were rejecting these either or dichotomies. It's either faith or finance. It's either one option or the other. It's either stay open or close. It was a more conjunctive imagination where they saw the possibilities in the ordinary spaces that they inhabited. I think about Emily Hull McGee's contribution, where she talks about the faithfulness of letting go, where they discerned a way to tear down 2/3 of their facility and yet reinvigorate mission and ministry in Winston-Salem. It's this beautiful conjunctive imagination. I also think that the wisdom that guides adaptation out of this moment is a convening wisdom, where we learn to gather together. And as we are gathered together in a more porous collective, this collective work becomes the space where we can not only discern how best to adapt, but find the connections for collaboration, the wisdom for contextual engagement, and this conjunctive possibility where we can see the both and. But I know this isn't, this is complicated. It's particularly complicated around matters of faith and finance, because they're markers of position, prestige, and power. So as you think about the complexity of money across these 4 C's, Aaron, how do you think about how we may untangle the complexity of these matters?
So I'm reminded just over this past weekend, Dustin, I need to forward this to you. There was a Episcopal News Service article that came out. Some of our participants maybe even saw it, about a congregation named St. Bede's in New Mexico that they set aside 10% of their operating budget over the course of a year, and they canceled over $1 million worth of medical debt for the state of New Mexico and Arizona for over 700 families. That is the type of philanthropic imagination that I think speaks to both those 4 principles that you were describing, this both and, right? And it also begins to provide a real practical example of the fluidity of power, the dynamic. Because I think that there is something to how we understand releasing power and how we generate it. In this case, we saw both happening at the same time. I can recall in one of the articles, there was numerous articles that came out. One of the quotes said, they interviewed a participant saying they opened up their letter, they were unsure what they were going to do, how they were going to pay the bills, and they felt like they had the power to make choices again.
Wow.
They felt like they had agency. So that gift of releasing debt did so much more than cancel a debt, but it created a sense of generated power. I think that philanthropic imagination at its best holds both of these principles to be true, the release and the generating of power together as communities. So another way that this can be framed has been a bit of the work that I describe in the volume around philanthropic redlining and around how we use data. So a bit of my background, for a few years, I worked at Trinity Wall Street in the grants office. I worked at the Episcopal Church Foundation in charge of capital campaigns and annual giving. Beautiful people, wonderful work. What I often tried to do was I would take data and I would use that data to create practical strategies for giving. And what I didn't know for quite some time was how that data did not reflect people of color. Primarily, it was white people who would fill out surveys, and it was primarily white people like me who would take that data and through my own lens, sift through it and create stewardship practices for congregations. And you can see how this became a practical way in which systematic racism continued. And so there's also a piece of extrapolating power and generating power when we ask the questions of who is not showing up in the data? How is our stewardship practices reflecting or not reflecting the diversity of our churches? Where do we need to release different questions that bring new data in for this type of philanthropic work together?
That's so good, Aaron. And it brings to mind David King's chapter about the ethics of giving.
Yeah.
It's this reflection that talks about moving from mechanics to ethics. We don't just need to think about how we give, we need to think about the manner in which we give. And he raises the question about what is a good gift. It seems like in that story of the person who opened the letter, they found that they received a good gift because it gave them power back in a new way and it released power. I'm also mindful as I think about David's chapter and this reflection, how one of the things we saw time and time again is that there's innovation emerging within existing institutions and also at the edge and beyond institutions. It seems like the example out of New Mexico is an innovation within and also at the edge. So as you think about our work with these authors, what are some of the emerging conceptual frameworks that you think are guiding innovation within and beyond the edges of institutions?
So some of the conceptual frameworks are, the first I would identify is one that we found, and I talked about briefly at the beginning of our time together, this idea of experimentation, providing permission for new life, permission to fail, permission to show up with our whole authentic selves into the work and bringing our authentic selves, knowing that in some spaces that might mean being the element of difference in the room. I think that there's also an element of trust. And I think that that's something that as we move forward, as we're inviting stories, that the trust that comes with recognizing that we don't belong just to ourselves, but to one another, it's that level of trust that will invite a level of curiosity that can bend itself towards imagination. We aren't able to imagine together if we can't trust the partners that we are working together with. And to be honest, some of us have some work to do in order to bend further towards others to be able to invite trust in a new way. Also, I think that there's this continued framework of belonging. So what does that mean to belong not just with one another, but to belong for one another? How do we show up for others? Shannon Hopkins and Mark Sampson talk a lot about how trees and the ecology of trees don't rely on their own self-sustaining work. Rather, a tree relies on the entire forest in order for its survival. And I think that that's something that we all became very clear about as we were all in our homes, is that we need one another. And this belonging, this fragile belonging, is part of the conceptual framework. I wonder, as we think about what nurtures possibility, Dustin, what comes up for you?
Yeah, I resonate with you, and I think it emerges from these spaces of belonging, where it's actually these points of intersection and connection between individuals and different sectors across the ecology that become the spaces in which new things may emerge. And I think it's not just the intersections themselves, but actually the spaces where trust, belonging, a shared history, common language, meaning, worshiping practices, where these all combine in ways that create the structure of a new imagination. Without trust, without shared practices, without the appropriate resources and space to innovate, we don't have the ability to take the risk. I'm mindful that for us in this project, we had the institutional space to take a risk. Granted, it was still a risk, and it was a risk that we each took in different ways, and we invited our authors to take that risk. But I believe that there are people who have the ability to innovate, but they maybe don't have the structures to take that risk. I think that's what some of Amy Butler's beautiful work is doing through Invested Faith, is creating structures and alternative funding mechanisms to invite people to take a risk. I think it's also possibility also emerges as we begin to think about our work in communities as being a form of stewards of saints. I'm thinking about the people who might be gathered on this call, whether they're people who manage budgets or work as consultants or, possibly do development or maybe even steward finances or care for their people as a priest or at the lay level. Each in their own way, these folks are stewards of saints. They carry the stories of faithfulness that has come before us in our communities of faith, these stories of faithful belonging, these stories of loss and grief, these stories of ongoing abundant generosity. They carry and steward these stories, and they also steward them in a way that transmits them to the saints that will follow. So I think as we begin to see ourselves as stewards of saints, it gives us the ability to place ourselves in a broader communion where we belong to the particulars of our contextual home and congregation, but we also belong to others throughout time and history. And in crafting and seeing that belonging, we're able to imagine what's possible. Because even when we feel alone, even when we feel isolated, we belong to others and we participate in a broader communion.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. Erin, one of the things that brings to mind as I think about being stewards of saints is that this time has been marked by incredible death and grieving. I recently talked to a pastor who said in this COVID moment, he did at least 3 COVID funerals a week.
Yeah.
Just this unshakable encounter with death and collective vulnerability. And for each of us, it's personal in different ways. And I'm mindful of some of our authors who wrote about death and letting go of the former things. So in this moment of grief, in this moment of loss, how do we find hope to see possibility in the midst of the gravity of crisis?
That is the big question, isn't it? How do we find hope in the midst of this? And I think, Elvira, this will speak to a bit of your question that you put in the chat. So there's so much I could say about this. It's found in so many of the stories in the book itself. So with holding people accountable for philanthropic imagination, for philanthropic redlining, one of the places of hope that I found was in the story of the Collective Foundation, which is a nonprofit that was founded as an institutional response to this philanthropic redlining, that specifically fundraised in order to do the first national work, qualitative work around giving characteristics of people of color. And they just published their results this spring. And I want to note that the Episcopal Church House of Bishops were the first to put in almost $100,000 towards that. And that, if that's just not a sign of prophetic witness to the church, I don't know what is. That was a beautiful moment. The research itself can be found at Collective Foundation. However, that's one of many stories found throughout crisis and care. I'm reminded of Emily's beautiful passage where she talks about how, as you might recall Dustin's explanation, they right-sized their plant by removing 2 of their buildings. And in that process, they became far more acquainted with their collective identity. They talked about how they removed the former things and God brought about a new thing within them, a new identity, a new way of being together. And it was in flexing that muscle around who they were and who they wanted to be that they felt that they entered the pandemic with internalized resilience, that they knew that they could do this work of asking, who were they going to be in this moment? I'm reminded of Patrick Reyes, who offers us a vision of his grandma's table. And he has this beautiful line where, I'll try and read just a little bit of it. He talks about, how do we reframe liberation for the inheritors of oppression? There are those who benefited from taking from my community, who stand not just on our shoulders as we prop up the unjust and unfair system that keeps your feet on our necks, but stand on the hallowed ground where our ancestors and our own blood mixed with the soil. How can we find freedom? How can we create a future where our children will thrive? How do we remember the dry bones as they speak with the ground, as they say to each other, we also feel this pain, because both know what it is to be drained of our sacred and divine worth. He writes, these answers are simple. We design with the community in mind. We set the table with the community in mind. I received a text from a reader actually recently who just read the book. And as she was working her way through the chapters, I also experienced hope when she said these chapters invited me to reclaim a different identity for myself as a person of faith. She realized that she needed to let go of a former narrative where there could no longer be room for that type of thinking. She found out that there would be love in that place where she needed it. We were asked, she would love a list of the resources the panelists are sharing verbally and the name of the book. All of the folks that we are listing are part of the book, Care and Crisis Meditations on Faith and Philanthropy. And in just a moment, I'm happy to show you where you can find that book, but I love that question. Thank you, Karen. So as we think about the different places of hope, Dustin, what springs up for you?
Yeah, Aaron, I think it's this space where we find the practices that can ground us.
Yeah.
Working with these authors across this volume was a practice that kindled my hope. in this space of precarity, in this space of crisis, in this space of uncertainty. Their words, their wisdom, their language rekindled my hope. It gave me a renewed attention to the importance of rest and Sabbath. It directed me to see the power of storytelling and the beauty of the ordinary stories. It formed in me an imagination to see the spaces of belonging and the way I can work in and across those spaces in ways that craft belonging. In some ways that may be an active participant, and other ways that may be just sitting at the table and to listen. In so many ways, their words were the space of my hope, and the beauty of their witness gives me hope for philanthropic imagination emerging out of this. What about you?
Dustin, real briefly, as I'm mindful that in a few minutes our folks might be dropping off, and I want to make sure we have been describing people's stories. If it's okay, I'd like to show them the faces of those that beautifully wrote, because I take such joy in looking at the group that assembled and thinking about them. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see them again. Hold on, here we go. All right, these, you heard us talking about the authors today, and every one of our stories comes from the chapters of today's book, apart from the St. Bede's that just happened this past weekend. These chapters are part of the volume Care and Crisis Meditations on Faith and Philanthropy that just launched 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks on Thursday. And Dustin and I are humbled by the positive response that it's received. But this is where you can pick up a copy either at Whitfinstock or Amazon or at your local bookstore. I'm going to leave this up just for a short minute, and then Dustin, I'd like to return back to your question because it was a really good one about what are the practices that I am seeing and I'm engaging with. One of the biggest practices that I'm finding, and I loved your, I love the practice you recommended around Sabbath and taking rest. It's one that I feel the need to practice myself, but I think another one is providing ritual around grief and making space. I was reminded as a friend's father died of COVID while we were writing the book. He wrote that he missed having a place to perform the regular traditions and regular rituals that come with grieving a loved one. We all have been missing our rituals. And so providing a place and a space, ritual for that work is going to be really important. I'm also, as I think about the different practices that we're engaged in, I think that there's also some permission giving is a practice we need to do. We need to give ourselves permission to experiment, permission to try something like this book. Try a book or try a new way of being, try a new question, try a new relationship. It's all an experiment, but give yourself permission to fail. Give yourself permission to succeed. Give yourself permission to love.
Good.
I think finally, when I think about the stones that we carry over the practice, there's an act of claiming a particular stone that I think matters a lot to this work, which is the story about how God shows up again and again and again and again in our moments of crises. God is there. And with that, I think that would be a wonderful way for us to close with a final reading.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Before I jump to the read, I do see one question from one of our friends here about the relationship between innovation and imaginative work that stays connected to the history of religious and doctrine. And I think that's an excellent and complex question. And my invitation is to always go back to context and go back to the tradition that one stewards. And my hope is that emerging out of that engagement and that collective work, you all might be able to discern how best to innovate in ways that remain faithful and also faithfully fragile, if you will, as Eric Barreto suggested. And by way of closing, I will read a section from the conclusion, pages 144 through 146. It begins on page 144. These stones we carry, these chapters, they mark our grief. They give space for listening, for testifying to our deaths and remembering our profound losses. As the people of God crossed over the Jordan, we too will mark this time with stones. Stones that bear witness to our struggle, that bear witness to our humanity, that give witness to thousands of deaths through institutional racism, a terrible pandemic, and our inability to care for one another. We will mark this time with the stones of memory and story. As Aaron noted, Aimee Laramore once noted that we often are quick to think of philanthropy as the 3 T's of time, treasure, and talent. In doing so, we leave out a crucial act of faith and philanthropy, the power of testimony and testifying to our story of God in the world. So as we stand on the bridge between starshine and clay, we recover new images and new language in the stories of those who have come before us. We imagine new economies and ways of being with and for one another. We kindle hopeful imagination in our communities when exploring where faith and philanthropy meet. We remember we belong to one another. So in this moment, as we linger in the shadows of the space of crossing over, ecclesial imagination arises where crisis and care converge. It has been such a privilege to share this space with you, such a privilege to join you on your work to be stewards of saints, and as you work to find the space of where crisis and care converge. So thanks for joining us. We wish you an abundance of hope and abundance of gratitude to carry you forward.
Thank you all.